All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's 9 o'clock briefing, Emotion Recognition Technology, Present and Future. We have three speakers on our briefing today. They are Lisa Feldman Barrett, Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University, Seth Pollak, Professor of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Aleix Martinez, Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Ohio State University. We'll start by hearing a few remarks from each of our speakers, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thanks.
Great. Good morning, everybody. So about a little over 3 years ago, the Association for Psychological Science approached me to put together a panel of senior scientists to write a paper for a journal called Psychological Science in the Public Interest. And the question was whether or not there are universal facial expressions of emotion. And part of the goal was to try to deal with a decades-long, maybe even centuries-long debate about whether or not everyone around the world smiles when they're happy, scowls when they're angry, frowns when they're sad, and whether people around the world recognize these expressions as expressions of emotion, in part because there is an increasing use of these expressions, these facial movements, to detect emotion in people using technology like emotion AI. And so a panel of five of us, five senior scientists, three of whom are here today, got together. We didn't actually, most of us didn't know each other, and we all came from different theoretical perspectives. So this is a deeply entrenched debate, and the five of us live in different parts of the country. One of us actually lived outside the U.S. And so we met over video conferencing for about 2 hours a week, sometimes more. And we read more than 1,000 papers together. And we came to consensus over what the literature says. So this is really, I think, the first time really in the history of this question that a set of scientists who have come from very different points of view came to consensus. We surprised ourselves. But we think of it as, we set things up to make it possible for us to find consensus. We worked very hard to leave our prior hypotheses at the door and just really focus on the data. And we covered a number of different scientific domains in this review. And the general punchline is basically this. On average, if we're talking mainly about adults in urban cultures, on average, people scowl, for example, when they're angry about 30% of the time. That's significantly greater than chance and gets you a publication in a journal. But it's what scientists would call low reliability, because approximately 70% of the time, adults do not scowl when they are angry. They are doing something else with their faces. And people also scowl when they are not angry. They scowl when they're concentrating. They scowl when someone tells them a bad joke. They scowl when they have gas. They scowl for lots of reasons, and this is what we would call low specificity. So if a scowl has low reliability as an expression of anger, and it has low specificity as an expression of anger, that means it is not the expression of anger. It is a expression of anger that people will show in certain circumstances, but not others. And generally speaking, what we determined across many different domains that we studied is that people do not move their faces randomly, but they do move their faces in highly contextualized ways. And so any AI that is claiming to detect scowl and interpreting it as detecting anger has some real problems. I should say this summary that I just gave you doesn't just hold for anger, it holds for every single emotion category that we looked at. And I'm going to turn over to Seth now.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I mean, we think about it with regard to scowls, but I'm sure from your own experiences, you can apply this to other kind of facial movements like smiling, right? The smile is the prototype of somebody feeling happy or pleased, but sometimes we smile or laugh when we're nervous. Sometimes we smile when we're being condescending. Sometimes we smile in a sexually predatory way. So, it really just filling out Lisa's comment that this really can apply to all different kinds of facial movements that you can think of as they relate to how we interpret or infer somebody else might be feeling. I'll say just a word about children and infants. And the primary interest here about addressing this complex question with regard to very young humans is babies don't have filters. Children are not, as anyone who's been around children knows, they're not really good at following social rules and mores and being polite. And so the idea is by looking at what children do with their facial movements in different kind of situations, you kind of get this first sense of, well, what is the brain doing here? What does the brain already know? How is it processing this kind of information? And earlier, maybe from 40 years ago, the literature suggested that babies sort of had these little kernels. We arrived in the world with these little kernels or nuggets of knowledge about emotions, particularly things like happiness and anger and fear and sadness. And people claimed that they could see these in newborn and very young infant facial expressions. But of course, when we went back and reread all of these classic papers and really looked at the details of the methods and reanalyzed the data in terms of how specific and how sensitive these kinds of facial movements were, what we found, in fact, is that infants do not have these kinds of categories. What infants appear to enter the world with is a sort of very general distress system. So babies are very good at letting people know and responding to whether everything's cool, everything's very copacetic and calm, or things are not okay. But beyond that, things are not okay, there's really little specificity there. What's fascinating is that often parents will say, I know my baby's cry. That's her tired cry. That's her hungry cry. But in fact, when you take recordings of babies in these different contexts crying, and then later, without any context, play them to parents, they're at chance. And so what seems to happen, what's great about having a general distress cry is it's general, it's easy, caregivers know, they might know what the problem is, but that cry brings an adult caregiver to an infant, and then the adult caregiver can hypothesize test. Does this diaper need to be changed? When's the last time you ate? Have you rolled onto something? But beyond that, it is very, very general. And then there are some things that young children do that can be very confusing. So babies smile and babies laugh, and it's very easy to say, this baby finds what's happening delightful. This baby is entertained. This baby finds it funny. But of course, one of the problems here is that babies laugh and smile when they get very aroused. And so when something in the environment changes, that causes babies to laugh. When something is very stimulating or loud or moving close to them or farther away from them, something's changing, that causes babies to laugh. Babies smile when they have gas. They do all sorts of things that adult observers, given a situation, might overinterpret as a baby showing a particular emotion when that is not the case. The last thing I'll say, which is, I think, a very compelling future direction of all of this work, is the older arguments about emotion being hardwired into the brain was that it's so complicated. All of this complexity about how we feel and how we let other people know what we're feeling seemed so complicated. People said, well, how would young children ever be able to master this if we didn't come equipped with some kind of core knowledge or kernels about this stuff already wired into the brain? I think that was the appeal of this notion of some emotions just being part of the human brain. But in fact, some of the studies that we've done and other people have done have shown that in fact, human infants are incredibly powerful learners. And we've done some experiments showing that even within a few moments of exposure, very young children can start to change how they categorize the inferences they make about how somebody feels just based upon the perceptual information that they're seeing. And so it looks like we actually don't need to be born with this knowledge. Human brains are actually able to figure out patterns and make inferences about what might be going on at a very, very sophisticated computational level with actually very little experience. So I'll turn it over to Aleix to talk about adults.
Thanks, Seth. So I'm going to talk about the implications of all of this in technology. And the main reason is because there have been so many claims out there that algorithms, computers can now detect whether you're happy, sad, angry, etc., fearful in a specific situations by just taking a picture of your face. And as Lisa and Seth just stated, that is based on a flawed hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that we always smile when we're happy and we always scowl when we're angry. And in fact, we smile under a variety of conditions and we scowl in a variety of conditions. So there's no way that technology will ever be able to detect the emotions that you're experiencing following that approach. What technology can do is it can detect your facial muscle movements, what we call now facial configurations. And these facial configurations are very important to communicate non-verbally between humans. So we're not here to say that facial configurations are not important, but that they are part of a very complex, poorly understood system to communicate between humans non-verbally. My group, for example, had a paper a couple of years ago in PNAS where we showed that when you internally experience an emotion, you release peptides. Most famous peptides are hormones like testosterone, cortisol, and so on, and that this actually changes the blood flow, blood composition, and because the face is innervated with this huge number of blood vessels, your face pulsates in color for period of time, you can actually detect those hormonal changes. The body pose is important. Body motion, context, as Seth was talking about, is extremely important. You can see the face, for example, I had in a paper a face of a guy completely red, screaming, mouth wide open, eyes almost closed, and you showed this image to people, and based on this facial configuration, people would say this person is extremely angry, right? This is a very negative emotion. But when you showed it in context, that was a soccer player celebrating a goal with the arms stretched, which made a lot of sense, and then that's a very positive emotion, right? So you're going from very negative to very positive. So it's not only the category itself, it's even the valence of that emotion that changes. So if a computer vision system or a machine learning algorithm is ever to understand human emotions, it does not only need to extract facial configurations from the image, which they can already do. It needs to understand the facial color, it needs to understand the body pose, it needs to understand the contextual information, it needs to understand, as Lisa has said many times, the situation that person is situated in, the culture of that person, depending on the culture. Things get modulated in different ways. So until that day, computers will not be able to read your emotions. And even before that, we still need in the cognitive sciences to run a lot of experiments to actually understand better, much better understand how emotions are produced and understood by our peers. And maybe a last point I would like to make is that humans are not 100% perfect, right? Far from that, in fact, to understand other people's emotions. So if that's true, which we believe that it's beyond true, as Lisa said, 70% of the time we don't scowl when angry, which means that, it's going to be very difficult. Maybe with these other variables that I've mentioned, you can go to 40, 50%, but you're never going to be close to 100%, which means that computers will never going to get close to 100% either. So there could be a small degree of interpretability from a computer vision system on how you are, or what you're experiencing or what you're trying to communicate. But there's never going to be 100% certainty that that's exactly what you're experiencing. And this is very important because there are many companies right now already they are claiming to be able to do that and apply this to places where I find really scary and dangerous. For example, in hiring people. So some companies require you to submit a video CV And then this is analyzed by machine learning system. And depending on your facial expressions, they hire you or not, which I find really stunning, really not only based on a wrong hypothesis, but a dangerous hypothesis. And not only that, excuse me, not only that, but that many of the systems are actually trained with data from the US or Europe, mostly white male faces and white male culture, which means that the systems are going to have a huge, huge influence in the hiring of minorities in a negative way, which is actually going to make things worse, not better, as they stand now. I've seen also a system we've seen in our analysis that we did for the paper. We've seen many other problems in the judicial system, in the classroom, where systems are claimed to be able to tell you whether students are learning or not. Like, there is absolutely close to zero correlation between your facial expressions and whether you're learning a topic or not in the classroom, and so on and so forth, right? So these things are very important, we believe, and they have to be called out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We'll open it up to your questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone. Kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. We'll start here.
Robin Williams, ABC in Australia. I can understand young people, babies, smiling happily. We smiled happily. Otherwise we didn't get fed or cuddled. But later in life, most of us who are male become curmudgeons. And there's a default position of frowning just to either keep people away or look like alpha males. But seriously, I wonder whether there's a gender difference that you found in any of this regard, and is it important?
Do you want me to? Yeah. Okay. So first of all, there are structural differences in faces at rest. So when your face is at rest, it's not completely still, but it's, if your face were completely still, you would look like an avatar. But at faces at rest, even what we call at rest, which means slightly moving, differ in their structure. So even though it may look like people are scowling or frowning, actually sometimes that's just a face at rest. And it turns out that men have a male structural face, the sort of the structure of a male face is more likely to look slightly frowning than an adult female face. In terms of gender differences, there are gender differences in how much people move their faces. Women move their faces more than men. But there are no gender differences really in terms of how expressive people are. That men are just as likely to make facial configurations that other people perceive as emotion as much as women. Where there is a difference is in the inference of the cause. So we sort of loosely say things like, we read each other's emotions, but nobody reads anybody else's emotions. Our brains infer, they make inferences. And along with making an inference about what your facial movement means, your brain will make, what someone's facial movement means, your brain will also make an inference about its cause. And that's really where you see gender differences. People in Western cultures will look at a woman making an expressive configuration on her face and believe that she is an emotional person because she is smiling or scowling. And they will look at a male face making a similar movement and infer that he's just having a bad day. Right. So his facial configurations are due to the situation. Hers are due to the fact that she's an emotional person. And if we were in a different setting, I would probably use more colorful language than that.
And I can add just a brief sidebar to your question, which is on the issue of how well do we learn to actually mask what we might be truly feeling. It takes kids a while to do this, but girls master it much earlier. By about kindergarten in the United States, girls learn, there's a paradigm, just a wonderful paradigm that in the field we call it the shitty gift procedure, where kids are asked to do a task and they see a wrapped package and they're told, well, when you finish doing this experiment, you get this present. And in some conditions, inside is something like a cheap pair of broken sunglasses, plastic sunglasses. Little girls at around kindergarten age in the United States will force a smile and look up or look down and say thank you. It takes boys almost 1.5 to 2 years to get to the point where they can actually they can exert effort to try to convey something socially appropriate. Usually boys wear their hearts on their sleeves a little bit more.
And I should say another thing and say that we're all talking about, we're talking about the U.S. and we're talking about urban Western cultures or cultures that have been exposed to Western cultural practices and norms. When you start talking about small-scale, remote cultures, most of what we're saying doesn't even apply.
Exactly, yes.
The rules for facial movements and what they mean are different.
Question over here, then we'll come here.
Tom Keenan, Business Edge. We know that there are shopping websites that measure how long you linger on something in an attempt to do that. And, they might be wrong and they might be right, but they just have to be more or less right. There are store cameras that follow you around. So if you take all that information, not just the face, maybe we're focusing too much on the face, all the behavior, is it going to be commercially viable? I mean, obviously some company will try to sell it, but will they make money?
That's already being used. So if you're talking about the population, right, as a global entity, and you consider whether you can do better than chance, then the answer is absolutely yes, right? But that's a very low bar, right? That doesn't mean that, in it. Yeah, exactly. If you're a company, that's all you care about. But does this mean that for a specific individual in a specific context or situation, that behavior means X? Then the answer is no, right?
I would just also say it matters. A couple of things matter, I think, right? One is how much of the context are you measuring? So you can measure someone's face and you can measure their vocal acoustics, you can measure their body postures, but are you measuring them over time? There is a temporal context which is relevant there. Are you measuring their internal context? Each one of us carries around an internal context to our brains all the time. It's called your body. And the state of your body matters to what your face is doing, as does the external context, right? But I think I just want to make the point that using technology to predict who's going to purchase something is a really different use than using the technology to determine people's outcomes, like in a legal setting, in an educational setting, in a security setting, in an employment setting. And so I think it's really important. I mean, I know that's not what you were asking, but I'm just taking the opportunity to say, I think we have to take seriously the context in which this AI is being used, actually.
Question here and then in the front row.
Hi, Federico Cuxo, freelance and journalist from Argentina. Are there any facial expression that still haven't been categorized? I mean, in some cultures, facial expression that perhaps you don't know what it means, or perhaps no one had the time or the intention to study?
So what I will say is that you have, depending on how you count, 42 facial muscles, right? Or some number. It depends on how. There are lots of little ones, and it depends on how you group them. And I think we figured out, what does that mean, like 17 million configurations. Let's just say half of those are viable, because of course there are dependencies, right? So when you say, are there facial expressions that have been categorized? I think it's important to realize that we are categorizing. That's what our brains do. Actually, our brains evolved to categorize, to make meaning of sense data. And to my brain, your facial movements are sense data. And really how my brain works, and your brain and every brain, actually even other animal brains on this planet, they work by categorizing. But I think what you mean is, has anyone made the claim that certain facial configurations are the prototypic expression And the answer is, yeah, sure. Just look in history. And look across cultures. If you look in India, for example, they have a universal set of facial expressions. There's a kind of a dance that has these facial expressions that are proposed to be universal, and they don't look like the American set, which really comes from Charles Darwin. Actually, it really comes from Duchenne, who is a physician who Charles Darwin used his photographs. If you look at Charles Le Bon, who was he was the physician to the king of France, I can't remember which one. He had a set, they looked different. There's a German sculptor, he proposed a set in the 19th century, they look different. So one interesting thing is that people have been proposing across the globe universal expressions for a long time. They don't look very much like each other, right? And the set that we have now come from Darwin and other places. They are really Western stereotypes. And so are there other Western stereotypes? Yeah, there are. There are now about 20 or so that people have proposed. But they, just like any stereotype, they don't tell you very much about an individual person in an individual situation.
You can also keep in mind that, that expression, I'll believe it when I see it, but the inverse is also true. Often we see things when we believe them. And so different languages around the world have different words for emotion concepts that don't exist in English. And so if you grow up in a culture that has a word for a particular kind of feeling, you see that when you see people's faces move and you make that kind of inference. But if you grow up in a different linguistic environment where you don't have that concept, you might see those same movements but not think much of them. So it's really important to think about the cultural differences there.
Yeah, I wanted to add very quickly to this. So as Lisa was saying, there's been a discussion in the literature for centuries. Aristotle had already actually mentioned some of these categories. Descartes had his own. So several years ago, we set out to try to answer how many of these millions and millions of facial configurations you can actually see across cultures. So we collected 7 million images of facial expressions from 35 different countries that covers a lot of different cultures. And obviously, no human being can analyze 7 million images, but we have designed machine learning algorithms that can do it for us. So we did an analysis, and we identified 35 facial configurations that are used across all these different cultures and countries. And then we did a follow-up experiment where we actually showed those 35 images to the people in these 35 different countries. And there was the results, when you just ask them, label this image, open label, whatever word it comes to your mind. There is agreement between people, right, as Lisa said, but you're talking about 30% agreement, sometimes 40%, which is much better than chance, but many other people thought that it meant something else, right? So there is signal there, and most likely because our cultures have agreed that a specific expression is going to indicate X, Y, and Z. And those are mostly, by the way, expressions that we produce consciously, not unconsciously, which would be something that is innate. And we use them to communicate non-verbally, right? But if you then go to certain cultures that are poorly studied, because obviously our study could only cover countries that are mostly, wealthy in the first world. But if you go into very isolated tribes, then you don't see these 35 expressions, right? You see other expressions. So I would say there are definitely facial expressions that other cultures used that we still don't know of.
Question here in the front row, and then one in the back. And then.
Hi, I'm Aleix Martinez from The Economist. I've got two questions. One for Dr. Martinez. You talked about these algorithms that are out there trying to be used in hiring and firing to work out facial expressions. One assumes that when they're selling these algorithms, they claim some sort of scientific backing. Otherwise, why would anyone use them? So I wonder what you have to say about that. I mean, is their scientific backing just not possible? Because from what you're saying, it can't be. And a larger question for the panel is, your conclusions are striking, but they're also, how does that fit into the work that Paul Ekman has done, for example, on universal emotions and facial expressions, because that's the sort of thing that we all know, isn't it? That there's universal expressions and we can recognize each other's emotions and things. If you could comment on that.
Right, absolutely. I think that was going to both your questions, actually. I think that's what Lisa was trying to do at the beginning when she assembled that panel of senior scientists, because there was that hypothesis that has been, as I mentioned a minute ago, circulating since the time of Aristotle, at least, right? So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years where people assumed that there's this set of universal expressions that we all used and produce and recognize. So that's why computer vision scientists and machine learning scientists had assumed that that was a fact and that that hypothesis actually was true. And that's what we set out to test, right? Is that really true? Is that something that, are we basing our technology on a model that actually is actually correct? And the data strongly supports that, as we've said a couple times. Yes, you smile when you are happy a small percentage of the time, which is better than chance, but it's such a small percentage of the time that does not allow you to determine whether that person is faking the smile, being genuine about the smile, or is happy and not smiling, or is whatever other thing. So at that point, it renders most applications useless if you just use this facial configuration, right? Now, in the specific context, as we were talking a minute ago, if you're in, in a store or in an online shopping system, and you know the specific context, and over a whole population, you know that typically, or let's say 30% of the time, people behave in specific ways, then you can certainly use that information to improve your sales, right? And that's okay because it's an application. It's probably not going to have a huge impact on any particular individual. But once you start claiming that this 30% is useful to be used in the courts or in the judicial system or in the classroom or to hire people, then that's where you have a huge problem.
And I can speak, I'll just pick up on what Aleix said, and I can speak directly to your question about Paul Ekman's work. So I think the first thing to understand is that Aleix's point is extremely important. This hypothesis of universality did not start with Paul Ekman. It was there really much long, and even really at the dawn of psychology as a science in the 19th century, people were asking these questions. I think so there is a longer history here, which is sort of repeating itself, and it may be later after the panel is over, I could tell you that history. I'm not sure anybody else is really interested in it. I find it really fascinating. But if we take a look at there were two seminal papers that were peer-reviewed that Paul Ekman published, and one in 1969 and one in 1971. I'm going to actually cover this in my talk this afternoon. They were both, and I just want to point out, this is really important work that he did. It was hard work. It was one of the first times that psychologists had actually done something like this. He really went to Papua New Guinea, and he was looking at remote cultures and trying to do science in unbelievable circumstances. I mean, so there's a lot there that's important that he did. But the entire claim of universal expressions really rests on whether these small-scale remote cultures, which have very little access to Western cultural practices and norms, do they show the same facial expressions, and do they recognize the same configurations as anger and sadness and fear as people in Western cultures, particularly the U.S., which is where what the control subjects were in those studies. And the entire claim until 2008 was based on two peer-reviewed papers, which contained 4 samples from one part of the world. Since then, there have been a number of papers published. I can't tell you exactly how many, but I think it's 15 samples, several from our lab. So our lab has been to northwestern Namibia to test the Himba population. Anybody who's seen the movie Babies knows this. They were featured in that film. We've also been to Tanzania to test the Hadza hunter-gatherers. These are not an ancient people, but they do live in live in foraging circumstances in sub-Saharan Africa in an environment that was similar to our Pleistocene ancestors, where this is the cultural context in which some evolutionary psychologists have claimed that these configurations evolved as expressions. So if we were going to see them, we would definitely see them. If they were universal, we would definitely see them in this culture, and we don't. There's really important work that's been done now across the globe in remote cultures by a number of different laboratories and who do not replicate those initial findings. And there's an important story there about how the studies were conducted, what the methods look like, and how powerful these methods are to actually do what Seth suggested. It turns out, and this will be a theme that we talk about later in our session, the methods that were originally used, it's not just babies that are powerful pattern learners. Your brain is a powerful pattern learner. And if we set the experiment up right, you can learn something on the spot. You can learn to associate a word with a face on the spot, pretty much. And that's really what happened in those original experiments. And so the punchline here is not that Paul Ekman is wrong, all right? It's that he discovered something really important. It's just not what he thinks he discovered. He thinks he discovered universal expressions, but actually what he discovered is that humans are really powerful pattern learners, and words are super powerful and help us actually learn to interpret and guess at the meaning of each other's facial movements, even if we've never met and even if we come from very different cultures.
A question in the back, and then we'll come here, and then here.
I'm Arthur Landwehr with German Public Radio. Taking into consideration that computers are becoming more and more powerful, and we have made the experience that in many instances, computers are better than humans, face recognition, for example, things like that. Do you suggest that never ever there will be an algorithm being able to detect feelings in people on a very reliable scale?
So let me try to answer the question. It's a complicated question. Computers are very good and better than humans at tasks that have clear definitions. So computers, machine learning is very good, for example, at games like chess or even the game of Go, that people keep claiming the number of possibilities in the game of Go is larger than the number of particles in the universe. It really doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is that the rules of the game are clearly stated, and that you can program into the machine learning algorithm, and the machine learning algorithm takes advantage of that. So unless you know the exact rules, which we do not for emotion perception or emotion production, then there's no ways for you to actually code that such that the algorithm can get even better than humans. The only resource that you have left, well, you have two resources, I guess. The first one is to continue doing research in the cognitive sciences, which is one of the things that we propose, so that we better understand the rules of communicating non-verbally. Not just with emotions, but just generally non-verbally. And once we understand our nonverbal communication better, we can design better computer vision systems. Now, in that approach, computer vision systems will get closer and closer to humans, but it will probably not get better than humans because the rules come from what we understand a bit of human communication. The second approach would be a big data approach, right? So you collect billions and billions and billions of data points, throw it into a system, and find a statistical regularity. So machine learning algorithm just finds correlations, right? The statistical regularities or patterns among the data. The problem with that approach is that this is very data sensitive. And it's so difficult, almost impossible to create the data set that's completely unbiased in a way that will give you a good, that will extract good information of what an emotion really is in human communication or in human experiencing. There is, to my knowledge, I mean, I've thought deep and hard about this problem, as many of my colleagues, and we don't know of any way of collecting data in an unbiased way that is going to give us that amount of of data to analyze with a machine learning algorithm for the purposes of understanding what emotion really is, how it is produced, and how it is understood by the human visual system. So long answer, I know, to just say most likely not.
I do want to just make the answer slightly longer, though, just to add another dimension to this. So, yesterday I gave an address, and I was discussing the point that big data on an individual person over time may get you very good, actually, at understanding and be able to predict that person's facial movements and their body postures and so on in particular contexts. So I guess what I would say is, if we really want to approach this question in the way that Aleix is talking about, we have to really change how we do research. We have to really focus on individual people over time and discover, really like Darwin did, frankly, although he was, focusing on birds and mollusks and things. We need to focus. We have technology now that will let us observe people in measure them in a very high dimensional way, with lots and lots of signals from the face, from the body, from their brain, from inside their body and so on, outside context. And we need to inductively discover what their vocabulary of movements are and what they mean. And then we have to see how well those generalize. And if that sounds like a difficult, time-consuming, extraordinarily expensive project, it is. That's the problem we're facing. But we have companies, and we also have funding agencies which believe it's a simple problem that can be answered cheaply. We're talking about orders of magnitude more difficult. So I think in our paper, we outlined a program of research that was more consistent with what I would call population thinking, which is a Darwinian notion that's in the origin of species, as opposed to typological thinking, like you're going to find one pattern or three patterns for anger, and that's going to generalize across, large numbers of people. Big data on a large number of people will not allow you to predict an individual person very well. This has been known for 150 years in science, but we have to take it seriously. And when we do, then we will be able to put our hypothesis to the test. But that's really what it's going to require, a change in mindset and fundamentally orders of magnitude more funding to do this work.
If I may extend,
you can see why it took us 2.5 years.
If I may extend on that, going back to your earlier point, computers are so good at face recognition. I want to caution about that claim, because I know it's been all over the press, but there is no scientific study that has demonstrated that. These are anecdotal claims that people are making based on the uses of some technology that is coming out. I have been working in face recognition technology for the last 20 years, and I can tell you that I do not know myself of any system that can recognize the identity of a person on a picture if the population size is over a few million, let alone billions of people. So to claim that the technology is there, even for face identity, where the rules are very clear, person A is person A. There is no, to then extrapolate to things that as complicated as emotions, I think that's going to take quite a while. And the other clear example of this is self-driving cars, right? Because of the advances in machine learning, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, many of my colleagues said, we're being approached by all these companies. We're going to have, they're putting a lot of dollars into this, in the orders of billions. So we're going to have self-driving cars in the next 5 years. And I told them, you're not going to have self-driving cars in the next 10 years, let alone the next 5. And here we are 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, so I'm still predicting we are not going to have self-driving cars in the next 10 years because there are no specific rules, right, that we know of. Once you get into the road, many things can happen. It's not like the game of Go or chess. So emotions is even one step above that, right? We still understand even less about how emotions are used, communicated, what they mean. So until that day, we have a long ways.
So we've now reached at 9:46. We were going to end at 45 minutes after, but we can make room 208 across the hall available if the speakers have additional time. You can connect with them there. I know there were more questions that we want to get to, but thank you so much to all of our speakers. That was a fascinating briefing. Thank you.
Also, let me add, given the issues of open access, there's no paywall around this paper. So anything you report, any links you put in, all of your readers will have full access to this. The paper was published in a journal of the Association for Psychological Science called Psychological Science in the Public Interest. And that...
Yeah, if you just Google the name, you can find it, or you can go to. I have it on my website. It's freely accessible. And do you have it on?
Or if you just Google emotion expressions reconsidered, or any of our names, it comes up. But your readers can have full access to it.
And if anyone has trouble finding that link, even after all of that, just email one of us or give your name to Joseph, and he'll send you the paper.